Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Subawards Subcommittee session this afternoon. My name is Kevin Ritchie from Harvard Medical School, and I'm joined by my co-hosts. Introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Amanda Humphrey. I'm from Northeastern University.
Hi, I'm Kari Tetro, and I'm from the Institute for Systems Biology.
Okay, next slide. This is our agenda for today, and sort of like David mentioned, you can participate in the Q&A or the chat box at any time. And if you would like to speak, you can raise your hand using the Zoom function and we will unmute you. And I'm told that your video would remain off if that entices someone to participate even more. So feel free to chime in if anything on the agenda, if you have any comments to add. We're going to talk today about editing the FDP subaward templates to include adding state law to them, talk about some working groups on FFATA reporting that we'll be undertaking in the future, following up on the revised uniform guidance and the telecommunications ban. Also, again, hinting at some financial and invoicing discussions that are coming in the future as well as they pertain to subawards, a few other working group updates, and then since everyone's talking about UEI, we'll talk about that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, for those of you that have attended our subaward session in the past will recognize this slide is usually our concluding slide. So this time around, we've moved our friendly reminder slide from the end back to the beginning because it's still a friendly reminder, but we did want to focus on this message a little bit more this time around and go into a little bit more detail. There's no major trends that we've identified. It's just some issues here and there, just a little grumbling, but we felt it was necessary or worthwhile to just revisit some of the justification for why we shouldn't be adding terms or changing the templates. So when we say changing the FDP template, that can mean two things. It could mean changing the terms and conditions within the template such that you would have to remove the FDP moniker and end up with your own version of the subaward template. It could also mean adding additional terms to the existing template. So when it comes to the former, everyone is pretty much seems to understand that if you do substantially change the FDP template, everyone is okay as a pass-through entity with removing the FDP moniker and kind of taking this new revised template in its own direction. We don't see too many problems with that. And then FDP members, when serving as subrecipients under non-FDP members, have been very helpful in pushing back on past non-FDP pass-through entities that are trying to change the template to remind them that they should be removing the FDP moniker. And we appreciate that assistance in trying to maintain the consistency and the reliability of the FDP brand. But then you also have adding additional terms either in the free text box within the FDP template or via additional attachments, which is something that we're seeing a little bit more. So if you're dealing with a non-FDP subrecipient, you might be very well justified in adding additional terms and conditions or adding your own attachments, for example, like an invoicing template or whatnot. And so it might be, these changes might be warranted when you're dealing with non-FDP subrecipients. You know, chances are they might be slightly higher risk, or you might be less familiar with doing business with them. And we as the FDP and the subaward subcommittee are obviously less concerned with when members are adding terms and conditions in dealing with non-FDP subrecipients. However, we are always a little concerned when FDP members feel the need to add terms when dealing with other FDP members. We're supposed to be, predominantly on the same page. FDP members are generally lower risk. Being an FDP member is supposed to provide benefits like not having to negotiate the templates or deal with additional terms. And the templates also do represent the prevailing consensus of all 217 of us now. And most importantly, they work as is. So additional terms are often not truly necessary. But then you might ask, why is there an additional terms box? Why is there this free text box in attachment 2? And if you go to our FAQs on additional terms, you'll see that you can add additional terms. This is something that is absolutely permitted. But FAQ 52 kind of lays out some of the caveats in that additional terms should be very well justified, meaning that they should be mandated by law. They should be included in the prime award, the prime notice of award. They should be reasonable, not unduly burdensome. They should be project specific in that they're tied to specific concerns about the project that you're working on or specific subrecipient risk. And one sentence in the FDP, in the FAQ number 52 here is that the FDP strongly discourages the use of this space for generic imposition of additional terms like choice of law, insurance requirements, and indemnification. And so even if you're wording these requirements in a way that's generally acceptable to other institutions, they're still probably superfluous and unnecessary. And even if you're adding terms that don't really apply to the subrecipient, you should expect some pushback on that, because if they don't apply, it's better for them to be removed than to be added as just another term that both institutions need to track. We're also concerned when people add additional terms, the risk of those terms conflicting with other parts of the template or undermining other parts of the template. And some examples are when we see pass-through entities add additional terms related to invoicing or reporting requirements in particular that go above and beyond the standard requirements. It kind of defeats the whole point of having the standard requirements in the first place. And if these additional invoicing and reporting requirements are not truly required, then we strongly discourage pass-through entities from including them in their subawards. And I also want to point out that not all of these issues are coming from new Phase 7 members. We see some issues raised from institutions that have been with FDP for a long time, and we might think would be more familiar with the guidance. But remember, adding additional terms makes things more burdensome for the pass-through entity as well. And that leads me to my point here about, or a reminder about uniform guidance in 200.208. I guess this is a often ignored part of uniform guidance. And if you were to go read this section, it says pass-through entities may adjust award conditions, just like our FAQ says you may add additional terms. But it says if you do that, you must notify the subrecipient about a few things. And this is what, just in my anecdotal evidence, I've rarely seen pass-through entities do this. You must notify the subrecipient about the nature of the additional requirements, the reason why you're adding them, the actions the subrecipient can take to remove the additional terms, a timeline for taking such actions, a method for requesting reconsideration of the additional terms. And 200.208 ends with the sentence, any additional requirements must be promptly removed once the conditions that prompted them have been satisfied. So I'm not an expert here, and people might have other interpretations, and we'd be happy to hear thoughts, but I think this last sentence implies that there should be a specific prompt to add additional terms and conditions, and that the intent of this clause is really to get additional terms and conditions out of there and not add any additional unnecessary terms. Again, I don't think pass-through entities truly go back to 200.208 when they add terms and conditions, but just wanted to point out that, you know, this philosophy of removing additional terms comes from uniform guidance and not from like me or anyone that works in FDP or on the subawards templates. This is where the subawards subcommittee comes in. And just first and foremost, I want to say that we are here to help. If you're a pass-through entity straying from the FDP guidance, you should expect the subrecipient to either push back or contact the subawards subcommittee. And we will most likely contact the pass-through entity to try and mediate or resolve the situation. And it's very important to note that we treat these situations with the utmost confidentiality. And we've had subrecipients and pass-through entities share award-specific, situation-specific information with us. And we do not care about that. We treat it with the utmost confidentiality, and we're here to just help mediate and resolve situations where there's a disagreement or we can help clarify things. And it's important for us to do so. It's important for us to hear about issues because we do need to monitor trends to see if what we're dealing with is an actual trend or if it's just a one-off situation. We need to hear about issues because there might be a mistake. We might need to change something in the next iteration of the FDP templates. So we want to discover where those mistakes are, or something might need to be clarified in the next revision of the FAQs or guidance. And then we're also here to help reinforce consensus. People have already had a lot of these conversations in the past and have already done a lot of work to get us to where we are. So we want to just help reinforce the consensus we've already arrived at. And when you contact the subawards subcommittee, we do our best to respond to all the inquiries. We don't get to 100% sometimes, but we do our best to respond to all the inquiries we get.
Kevin, that was great. We have a couple of questions that came in.
Sure.
Do you mind if I also just add one thing? I kind of wanted to amplify one thing that you said, and that was just, you know, I think the intention of 200.208 and those specific conditions is adding additional terms and conditions is really the result of a risk assessment, right? It's got to be based on there's a specific thing that we as an institution are concerned about that we're adding to your award, and we put in these additional restrictive terms. It's not a blanket, we're going to add in these additional reporting requirements for every subrecipient we have because we're trying to, you know, cover any potential risk that maybe we would find. And so it's about striking that balance between we've clearly identified a real risk here, and let's just try and mitigate all risk by putting in a requirement for backup or additional reporting, et cetera. So we got a couple of great questions for you. What one person asks, how about changes only for technical compatibility to work, such as to work with Adobe Sign?
Yeah, I think I don't think those are changes to the terms and conditions, so it sort of fall outside of the scope of this discussion. It's a good question though. Of course, we want the template to remain very recognizable and the format to be very consistent. But I would say that if you're trying to adapt it into, you know, if it's just a technical change, this came up during the subaward delays discussion we had at previous sessions, where one of the recommendations was for FDP itself to explore different formats that might be more user-friendly for people that want to do what you're asking.
That's a great point. And actually, we're going to talk a little bit more about Adobe Sign today. And I think that the distinction I would make is between substantive or non-substantive changes. If you're adding in an electronic signature field, that to me seems totally within the intention of reducing administrative burden. But if you're adding additional substantive terms and conditions, then that's really where we're trying to draw the line. And then one quick question that we got, as I understand it, non-FDP members are able to make changes. So we should not contact the FDP if we receive an altered document from a non-FDP institution, correct?
Okay. Non-FDP members can use the template, but they would still need to adhere to the guidance that we provide. Now, can we hold them to that as much as we theoretically could an FDP member institution? Probably not. And this is where we need our members to help us out in flagging these situations. And we could even help in that regard if you feel uncomfortable or you'd rather the subaward subcommittee engage that non-FDP member. We can be there to speak about in more detail about if you want to use the FTP template, you can, but you still have to remove the moniker if you're deviating from the boilerplate terms and conditions. So please do contact us if you do see changes to the template that make you uncomfortable. We want to hear from you.
Can you speak to a change example, such as removing automatic carryover when the NIH NOGA allows automatic carryover and our institution is named in the special terms section of the NOGA? I think what this person is asking, if I'm understanding it correctly, the notice of award from NIH allows automatic carryover. The subrecipient in this case is named in the special terms and conditions, and they have received a subaward that is restricting their ability to carry over funds from one budget period to the next.
Yeah, so if you look at the template, this is one section where you have a drop-down menu with options. And so a pass-through entity choosing the option carry forward is restricted by the pass-through entity. That is an option that's available to pass-through entities. And we don't consider that changing the terms and conditions of the award. So anywhere you see a drop-down menu with options or check boxes, that pass-through entity is free to check or uncheck those. However, again, going back to the subaward delays survey that we did, we have evidence that about 5%, or maybe even less than that, 3%, 5% of institutions impose a carry forward restriction when the notice of award does not, when the federal awarding agency does not. So it should be very rare, but that is an option that is available to pass-through entities.
And I was fortunate enough to be able to work on the iteration of the templates where we added that distinction for the carryover restriction. And one of the reasons that we separated out the carryover is restricted by the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity is so that institutions who are subrecipients and feel that that is an incorrect way to go about it, they can push back on that and say, well, no, it's not in the federal award. We want to push back on this piece. It's a little bit more clear. If it comes from the federal government imposing that condition, you really can't push back on it. But you might have some ability to do so if it is added to your award by the pass-through entity. Another attendee is asked, we request a closeout document to be completed and submitted with the final invoice and usually include it with attachment 6. Is this okay, or do we need to find another way to convey this?
And this brings up a point. We did run into an issue recently where a pass-through entity did ask a subrecipient for additional requirements, but did not include them in the FDP template. So it did not include them as additional terms. And in this case, we have sort of like a worst of both worlds scenario where the requirements were unclear and that they were not specified, but then they were still levied upon the subrecipient by the pass-through entity. To be honest, I know this question here is anonymous, but you're probably veering towards the adding additional terms that might be unnecessary. I understand if you would like a closeout document, but I would argue that every pass-through entity has to close out all of their awards and subawards, and most FDP members manage to do this without a closeout document. So if it's required by institutional policy or by an external entity or state law or something like that, I just would expect as a pass-through entity, you would have to try and justify that. And I would expect pushback from subrecipients. It might be justified, but my sense is that you might be veering on towards unnecessary additional terms territory.
And I would also add that attachment 5 kind of constitutes a closeout checklist in and of itself. So it includes reporting throughout the annual life cycle of the award, but there are also requirements for the final technical report, as well as any other final reports that may be required by the federal funding agency, including anything related to invention statements, property reports or other deliverables and things that need to be filed. So perhaps there's the way to look at your closeout checklist that you're having subrecipients fill out and say, how can we leverage the information that's here on attachment 5 to identify the things that we're asking for. Please address the clearinghouse. It's unreasonable to answer entity information when it's available in the clearinghouse. As FDP members, we should honor the clearinghouse and use it to reduce burden.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that what we're talking about here is documents that exist outside of the subaward, like subrecipient specific questionnaires, which again, we have evidence that not too many people use these. So it should be use these anymore. So it should be rare. And the clearinghouse has helped reduce that burden. So yes, of course, we encourage everyone to use the clearinghouse as a resource to not reinvent the wheel or ask institutions for information that's already publicly available.
And somebody asked me to confirm, did I mean attachment 4 when I said attachment 5? Yes, it is attachment 4. With regard to the question about using the clearinghouse, from my experience, it has been up to the subrecipient to tell the PTE that we are in the FDP clearinghouse. Is it reasonable to expect instead that the PTE would determine if information is available in the clearinghouse before sending their subrecipient information form?
Both. I mean, just in reality, some pass-through entities are going to build into their business process to check, and we would encourage that. But a subrecipient should also, I mean, I've done this many times, just replied to an email with a subrecipient questionnaire on it with a hyperlink to our expanded clearinghouse profile and a few kind words to remind them that that's where our information lives. So, but both, I mean, you're going to see it both ways.
Clarification needed. Additional terms can be added to the template if it's related to oversight due to a risk assessment, i.e. backup support, record retention, etc.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the best reason to add additional terms. And I think that that's specifically why uniform guidance and the FDP FAQs and the template itself has an additional terms box. So in some cases, it's totally okay to add additional terms, just needs to be well justified. And I think a risk assessment is maybe the #1 reason to add additional terms.
Can you please confirm that it is not appropriate or allowed for an FDP member to add additional terms and conditions that ask for more rights in subrecipient IP than what is already outlined in the subaward?
Yes, I would say it's exceedingly rare to see additional intellectual property terms because we're dealing with federal awards here. So usually you're going to encounter more challenging intellectual property. You're negotiating intellectual property terms with subrecipients under non-federal awards. So I would say that it's probably not appropriate. I'm not an IP expert here, and most people who work on subawards aren't either, and they would defer this type of debate or negotiation to their technology development or IP offices to resolve, but we shouldn't really be seeing IP language as additional terms.
And if you've pushed back and that's something that continues to be a sticking point, that's one that we'd like to understand a little bit more about. So please feel free to reach out to us. This one, it says, has there been conversations about allowing for a drop-down or editable field on page #1, item #3 for when the final statement of cumulative costs incurred is to be submitted? We do have awards with a 30 or 60-day closeout, and we are needing to change the final due date to less than the listed 60 days. So for this one, I would just say most federal agencies are bound to follow the closeout procedures that are in uniform guidance, which should mean that if it is a federally funded award, you should not have 30 or 60 days. You should have 90 or 120 days. I believe it's 120 or more. And so 60 days should be kind of the perfect timeline. If you're talking about something where you've got a foundation award or something like that, please don't use the FDP templates for that instance because you're not flowing down federal terms and conditions, you're flowing another award down. But that's the primary reason we have not edited that. Item number 3 on page 1 is we do not want people changing the timeline for that final invoice below the 60 days when they're sending something out to a subrecipient, because otherwise that can really have an adverse impact on the closeout activities of the pass-through entity and the subrecipient, kind of on both sides. If you don't have your own subaward template for foundation awards, we recommend you take the subcontract sample, remove the FDP moniker, remove the reference to the FAR, and try and amend and use that. That has a fairly decent structure for a standard sub out to someone. We've recently had an FDP organization use a third party, I believe Qualtrics, to request our information. Much of the same information is already in the clearinghouse. Have you had anyone else report a similar situation? Can we utilize FDP subcommittee to work with other FDP members to eliminate the use of this third party?
The issue of institutions using their own, like whether it's Qualtrics as a third party or their own portal to process subawards, or even like at my own institution, we use DocuSign to route subaward drafts for review and signature, which not all of our subrecipients really like. So I understand people tend not to like to work in someone else's system or portal and whatnot. If we're talking about just purely gathering institutional information, I totally agree that we should be looking at the expanded clearinghouse. And Courtney added a comment here about expanded clearinghouse and what FDP members should be using it for. That's very helpful. Thank you, Courtney. But there might not be a way around, like in the future, I would imagine a lot of institutions are going to try and adopt systems to automate some steps in the subaward process. So if it's gathering institutional information, that should be discouraged, and we could try to address that. But if it's like, if you're seeing portals or different automated systems, I think that's like a good topic for the future that we can discuss as institutions roll them out.
Courtney clarified for Qualtrics, they can utilize the API. So if that's something that the commenter wants us to kind of put in writing or help you with, please let me know. Send an email to subawards@thefdp.org. It comes up at the end. And then just to read Courtney's comment really quickly for the community, in case anyone isn't able to view the Q&A. All FDP members and non-FDP member participants in the expanded clearinghouse must use the expanded clearinghouse first before asking for institutional specific information as part of the participation agreement. If there is an issue with another participating organization asking for institution specific information, please use the pushback language on the website or email the expanded clearinghouse subcommittee. If we want to highlight very important terms in the NOA, such as IRB restrictions, is it reasonable to add those in attachment 2 additional terms, or should we just leave them in the NOA since the sub is subject to the terms anyway?
Personally, I think that it's helpful to flag things that you might find to be particularly important, in which the sponsor is paying particularly close attention. It's always a courtesy if you can flag these for the subrecipient, and if you want to do that via email when you send a draft, great. If you want to include it in the free text box, great. I just would suggest copying and pasting the exact terms, and not panicking or adding additional terms, just highlighting exactly what the requirement is.
Some NASA awards recently have not provided us with 90 days as the PTE to submit our final invoice, but rather 60 days. So there are some federal agencies requiring the final invoices earlier than 90 days. I would say that's something to maybe push back on NASA and point them to the orderly closeout part of uniform guidance. And follow up on requesting an editable field for the closeout if there are multiple tiers of subs. We sometimes need to update that field as each PTE needs to shorten the closeout timeline. I think that's a perfectly valid point. Sometimes you do, and unavoidably so, have multiple tiers of subrecipients. At a certain point, though, it may not be kind of feasible to use the FDP subaward template at a certain point with certain tiers or levels down of subrecipients. But I think, the reason that we have not made that an editable field stands clear, and I don't know. I just don't want to put out an editable version and have other institutions then coming to us all the time, because routinely we would get people coming to us saying it's been changed to 45 days or 30 days. And it just became a point of negotiation. So I don't know that we would necessarily look at changing that on that particular document. I think it's something that we'd really have to see it being a very large part of the use cases before we would get to modifying the templates to accommodate that. One of the issues. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, do we want to move on? And we can there's a couple more questions coming in, and more can come in. Just in the interest of time, maybe we can move on and answer these towards the end, or via email afterwards in our meeting summary. Does that make sense? Okay, all right, yeah, let's move on a little bit. Great questions. I hope the answers have been helpful. This has been a really great discussion. Thank you for participating. And I did want to end the slide on a positive note, a couple of positive notes, actually. One is that it's usually not this audience that's responsible for adding additional terms, or responsible behind why institutions add additional terms. So when we bring this up at the FDP meeting and we have these conversations, hopefully that can help you if you go back to your home institution and want to have discussions about adding additional terms, or reinforce to people back home at your institutions what the requirements are in uniform guidance, or what the FAQs say. So hopefully we can help. And one example is force majeure language during COVID. I feel like that was a situation where a lot of member institutions showed restraint in avoiding additional terms and conditions and adding an unnecessary burden, or adding additional burden, even though that's a prime example of when maybe more terms and conditions would have been warranted by a specific reason. And even though FDB provided sample language to use, my sense from monitoring listservs, receiving subawards, monitoring the subawards inbox, was that a lot of institutions actually showed restraint and avoided unnecessary burden. So I think that was a great situation, administratively speaking, of course. The last thing on this slide, yesterday, if you attended the FDP strategic plan conversation, one of the components of the FDP's strategic plan is to tell a powerful FDP story. So this is a powerful FDP story. The subaward templates, those who've worked hard to create them and update them, those who work hard to revise the FAQs and guidance over time, and the vast majority of people that refer to the guidance and use the templates unedited. Subawards are a powerful FDP story. So let's keep the story going, especially as FDP as a whole wants to seek more engagement, deeper engagement with federal agencies, with our own members, and with individual volunteers. We want to know that if you volunteer to work on a subawards working group, that your work will be codified in a useful document, in helpful guidance, in clear guidance, and it will not be for naught. Like it will actually be used by the whole community going forward. So let's keep telling this powerful story. Next slide, please. Okay. On that note, state law and adding state law terms to subawards. I don't think we need to get into a discussion now. Feel free to chat any ideas that you have in response to these questions. But going back to frequently asked question number 52, it allows to add state law into FDP subawards. You can add state law, but it says that, there's some caveats here, like it needs to truly be required. And it should be, ideally, it should be applicable to that subrecipient and not just general state law that doesn't apply. But I don't know, we brought up this discussion in May. This is not yet a working group or a survey or anything like that. All we have is some anecdotes from a few different states. The situation varies from state to state. And so it's hard to tell where this is going to go in the future, but we're still taking examples and ideas that people have. And I would encourage you to reach out to us, whether you're a state institution or a private institution that's been a subrecipient of these additional terms. And again, I just want to point out that research administrators at state institutions usually don't like this either. And so they're not the ones that are unilaterally deciding to add state law into subawards. And we've talked to some of them. So if you're a subrecipient, please be patient and be empathetic with pass-through entities that are trying to deal with requirements at the institutional level or the state level for which there are no workarounds. But reach out to us. And like I said on the last slide, the Subawards Subcommittee co-chairs would be happy to help join a conversation to learn more about what the requirements are. But if you're at a state institution that has vetted state law requirements and has somehow been able to carve out subawards under federal research grants to academic institutions and not include state law in attachment 2, we want to hear from you. If you're at a state institution that's successfully coordinated what these requirements are across all your state institutions and are developing a standard template to or standard terms to include in attachment 2, we'd like to hear from you. And we would even open up the floor to have you present at a future subawards subcommittee session if you can show us an example of what's working. And just any examples of fruitful or not fruitful negotiations when it comes to trying to insert what's required by state law or required by state auditors for public pass-through entities. So I think that's all I wanted to say about this right now. We might develop a more robust frequently asked question about state law. We might be able to do something in the clearinghouse with state law. We might be able to upload a state law matrix to the subawards page on our website. So there might be some things that we can do here, but don't really have time or enough specific examples right now to get into it, but to be continued. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda to talk about FATA.
Hey, FATA reporting. Well, you guys thought you'd heard the end of this, but you hadn't. So if any of you guys remember, a couple of years ago, Stephanie Scott in particular was very active in helping FDP to kind of collate some of our experiences and some of the areas where we were thinking about ways that FATA reporting could maybe be improved. And it wasn't really ready to go anywhere just yet. And so fast forward to the 2020 compliance supplement, where there seemed to be a renewed government interest in FATA reporting, and it mentions it specifically as an area for auditors to test, and not just to see that FATA reporting was completed, but to test. In particular, it appears to be looking for data quality. So then we also have seen in other work streams that the GAO is slated to start looking at modernizing FSRS after they complete those SAM.gov updates, which ties to the UEI stuff that we will be talking about later. Next, please. So you probably noticed that Stephanie Scott and I sent an email out earlier this month because FDP is always thinking, how can FDP help? Well, we think that we're able and in a great position to help with this area because we've got a lot of great stakeholders that do FATA reporting and are passionate about the subject, and we've already got a lot of great feedback data and information available at our fingertips. So surfacing that information, even from a couple of years ago, Stephanie and I were able to pull it together into a draft survey, and we sent that out to everyone earlier this month, and we got some amazing feedback from the community, really helped us to clarify that survey. And we are actually in the process of loading it into SurveyMonkey, and we hope to get that out for people to respond to by the end of this week. So what we're really looking to do is work with OMB to connect with GAO, gather user experience information. We're hoping the results of the survey and the data that we gather will be used in those conversations with OMB and can be shared with GAO. We're also hoping that we'll be able to use this as an opportunity to perhaps engage GAO to have a user experience feedback session. If that's possible, we're not sure that it is, but we think that the survey data, regardless, will provide some really valuable information to assess workload, including the time and resources used, pain points, areas for improvement, and what's going well. And also just figure out, so how does the burden impact data quality and integrity? That survey will be coming out, it will, like I said, at the end of the week. We're planning to have it open for approximately 3 to 4 weeks. At the end of that time, we're going to collate the data. We're going to share that with OMB and with the community as well. And then hopefully we'll be able to use that to figure out what our next step should be and how FDP can help in this area. Oh, sorry, it's not OMB, it's not GAO, it's GSA. Sorry, I always mix up my acronyms. So we look forward to everyone responding to the FAFATA survey. I know it will be open for a very brief period of time, and you will probably have to coordinate with a couple of different people in your office to complete it. But we think that this is a really important opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about FAFATA reporting and how it impacts our business operations at our institution. So when you see the survey come out, please take the time to respond to it. We'd love to hear your opinions. Next slide, please.
So this federal regulation is kind of a pretty hot topic right now, and it has been since the Office of Management and Budget issued the final guidance, revising sections of the uniform guidance last year. Final guidance, which is the first major revision to the uniform guidance since it was implemented, included a lot of changes and updates, and some of them were very much anticipated. And one of the notable changes to the uniform guidance was the implementation of Section 889B of the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 through the addition of 2 CFR 200.216, which I'm sure we've all memorized exactly what that is. It prohibits federal award recipients from using loan or grant funds to enter into contracts or to extend or renew contracts from specific and certain foreign entities that use covered telecommunications equipment or any services. This went into effect August 13th of 2020, and in response, the FTP revised Attachment 1 of the subaward template last December to reflect the new term. So that's just kind of an overview, a little bit of a reminder. So since its implementation, there have been a lot of questions from the FTP community about how other organizations might be monitoring their subawardees' compliance with the federal regulation. And this is all just very rapidly evolving. So we wanted to briefly open up the session to discuss a few of the questions that we've seen. First, how are organizations screening foreign subawardees with regulation compliance questions, especially in countries where use of foreign telecoms is high? And second, have any organizations developed procedures to address this issue with their subawardees? So, if you're comfortable sharing with the group, feel free to raise your little Zoom hand and we can unmute you. Or you can share in the Q&A chat section and we can read it aloud. So I'm just going to pause and see if anyone, or, if no one is comfortable sharing, we can, just email and we can collate some information too. So we're all pretty curious. I am not seeing any questions or comments about this right now, so I'm just going to move on. So next slide, please. Invoicing is super interesting to me. We've all had, a lot of experiences with it, and something that Kevin and Amanda mentioned earlier. So kind of in response to that, a few weeks ago, we had a really great meeting with some of the folks from the Finance Audit and Costing Committee to talk about, potential collaborations with the Subboard Subcommittee, especially regarding invoicing. A lot of common issues with subaward monitoring, invoicing, things of that nature. And the consensus from the meeting was to hold 2 listening sessions on the topic, ideally having one in October and one in November, and then reporting out to the community at the January meeting. So the first session will focus on hearing the perspective of those folks doing the work of processing, monitoring, and paying subaward invoices from a pass-through entity perspective and a sub-recipient perspective. We really want to understand from stakeholders what areas of monitoring and invoicing subrecipients is working well and where the community may have room to grow. The second session will focus on hearing the perspective of managers and leaders. And at this session, we'll report out some key findings from the first session and ask, very specific questions focused on like a broader leadership perspective, such as how institutional auditors, budget constraints, organizational structure, and some automation are shaping the institutional landscapes. And really the overall goal is to better understand the issues we hear about anecdotally and see if we can surface some ideas for solutions, or, have a more systematic study of the issue. And you'll, expect to see these listening sessions scheduled in the near future. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, working group updates. So at the May FTP meeting, we asked the community to send us, their thoughts about the ICOOC MOU guidance and template. And thank you to everyone who shared thoughts, case studies, and scenarios. And these are all being reviewed. And at that meeting, we also asked folks to fill out a survey 1 to 2 times a month when you encounter or use the human subjects data attachment 7. We're still in the process of gathering data, so please continue completing the survey a few more times. And I know, Amanda, you wanted to add a few things about the attachment as well.
Yep, thank you, Kari. So I was just hoping that we would get more adoption of attachment 7. And so one of the great pieces of feedback we got was that there were some areas where we could further align it with the DTUA template itself that might help us to speed up adoption. And so we have a proposal on the table that we will be sending out in the next couple of weeks, expected to be at some point in October. We're just kind of finalizing some of the pieces where we'll show an old version or what the current state of the DTUA attachment 7 is, and then a proposal for modification to that part of attachment 7. And then we're just going to ask a 1-question survey about how that may or may not impact institutional adoption of attachment 7. So we just want to be sure that people are aware of that and they know that that's coming out.
So last but not least, the templates and guidance working group updates. Most of us know that these are working groups that they're ongoing and they do routinely update the templates and the FAQs. We're still accepting comments and feedback about those. So please keep sending those our way, and expect to see the next round of updates sometime in 2020. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Alice Reuter, who's going to talk about the new subrecipient monitoring tools working group. And I'm going to, I think you're unmuted, Alice.
Thank you, Carrie. Hello, everyone. I am Alice Ruther from Columbia University, and along with Tyra Darby-Lane from Northwestern University, we will be co-chairing the newly created subrecipient monitoring tools working group. Our mission is to be the liaison between the expanded clearinghouse and the Subawards subcommittees. We want to reduce administrative burden among members and non-member institutions through the creation of a new non-member institution profile in the expanded clearinghouse to host non-members institutions compliance information. And we want to create, review, and update tools like the financial questionnaire, the RAC, and the CAT to streamline compliance aspects of subrecipient monitoring and maintain and update this related documentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our goals is as I mentioned, the creation of the non-member profile template in the expanded clearinghouse. We want to invite non-members institutions to create their profiles in the expanded clearinghouse. And to do that, we will be sending a survey to our existing membership, asking for nominations of their subrecipients that they would like to have a profile in the expanded clearinghouse. We want to send surveys to our membership also regarding the subrecipient monitoring tools that we currently have, like the financial questionnaire, the RAC, and the CAT, to identify priorities. And based on that, we will create or update tools based on the results from the surveys. We are going to pilot solutions, and we would have a final official rollout of these solutions. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit small, but we have two phases on mind for the first scope of this working group. And the first phase is to work on these tools, sending them the surveys and creating the non-member profile in the expanded clearinghouse. The expected frequency for meeting is going to be twice a month, and it will be adjusted as needed. And we will have reporting expectations of monthly internally, because the way we envision this working group to work is that we will have 2 or 3 projects ongoing at the same time. So each small working group within our scope will have to report to Tyra and myself on a monthly basis, and then we will report back to the Subawards committee, and with updates to the membership during our FDP meetings. The estimated timeline for this first phase is between 12 and 15 months to completion, and we wish to start working on this project next month. So the first phase 2 of this working group is to operate on an ongoing basis and adjust or create new tools as needed based on federal regulations and again on membership feedback. And if you are interested in joining this group, please contact our Subawards listserv, Subawards at thefdp.org or the listserv, and we will reach out to you to connect and work with you. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm talking about Adobe Sign, which was brought up earlier. I also recently got used to Adobe Sign in the past year and how it interacts with the template. There are some interesting things that happen when you're trying to use Adobe Sign with the versions of the templates, because they have all these drop downs and different options. And the templates were developed potentially before Adobe Sign was really in frequent use. So there's a couple things that we're seeing happening. So if you have just the fillable version of the template, just naked, like without a signature, not flattened. If you're in the new subaward template in the 3B, you'll get an error when you try to do Adobe Sign because of institution type.
In the institution type selections, there's a blank because it starts with a blank as the default. And it's a similar kind of issue with the carry forward, where on the modification template, you have all these options, but it starts with blank as a default. So the idea with starting with blank as a default is you need to fill it in. So you can't start with something in particular because you may run into errors. Somebody may miss it. Somebody may just not think that they need to select it because it's already selected. So there are these blank spaces, but Adobe Sign doesn't like that. So if you try to send the fillable version out for Adobe Sign, you'll get these errors. And there's a couple of ways that we've found that you can address this in the next slide. So with the new subaward, if you are working with that 3B, you can just flatten it. Just fill in whatever is needed and flatten it and send it for Adobe Sign. You can add, after you flatten a PDF, you can add the different fields needed to fill in an Adobe Sign. You could also send the 3B just separately, completely, so that it's not a problem when you're sending to a subrecipient. But if you are sending a flat PDF to a subrecipient, of course, they can't fill in a 3B without you doing something else to it. So you can add your own signature via Adobe Sign. Like you flatten it, send your own signature via Adobe Sign, then send out. So it is a little complicated. And if other people have ways to work with Adobe Sign that are really easy, I'm happy to hear them and talk about them because I'm still working through it myself. With the modification though, I did discover there is something you can do to actually edit the field. If you're inside of the modification template, you can select a default value. However, again, that could lead to errors if you are worried about your users of the template selecting the right thing and knowing that if something's filled in, they still have to look it over. So if you select automatic as your default, it's going to be there. So someone might just run with it and that might not be accurate. So that's just one thing you have to think about, like what should your default be if you don't want it to be blank and you want to use Adobe Sign.
Thank you. Stephanie, we got just a quick question
Mhm.
in. Somebody asked, start with change.
Start with
I think they were
change.
trying to write down the steps of what you do, maybe from the previous slide. They want to know where maybe the starting point is.
Starting point to change. Like if you're in Adobe and you right click on a field, you should, I mean, it depends on what version of Adobe you have. You need to have something that can edit. So that's another thing. You need to have some editing capability.
They said use change instead of blank, I guess is their clarification.
Well, oh, right. If you put the word change in there as a drop down, I mean, maybe. I still think people could gloss over it because it's just filled in and they see it filled. But I feel like we've talked about this, you know, that you could do these technical things on your own and you can have your version of this because it's this minor technical thing that you could do to change it. But as far as the template that is presented on the website, it is blank. But I feel like you could have your own version where you just put in the word change.
Okay.
If you feel like your users can handle that.
Okay. Someone asked, would it consider and they have a period as blank? It would appear blank to the user.
It would. I don't know. I don't know. These are interesting thoughts. I have no idea. We could look at it.
Yeah, we can certainly look at it. Yeah. I've started my drop-down menus with and then they have the select, like bracket, select, bracket to avoid a blank space. Another comment.
Yeah, I think there are lots of ways to do it, and depending on your system and how things work, you could do things differently. And the templates are editable. If you have an editable version of Adobe, you can edit it. Nothing, there's no password, nothing stops you. We just don't want you to change, you know, the substantive language.
Next slide, please.
Okay, this one, pretty simple. I think people are aware of this pending change from DUNS to unique entity identifier. What we've done are people that have helped revise the templates have added a UEI field to the bilateral mods that are currently posted to the Subawards website, and also revised attachment 3B to read UEI/DUNS for now. And our next round of substantive changes to the templates will be in 2022. So, you know, we will keep up on the UEI discussion, and I'll just speak for a few other people now. Like you saw in the listserv, the expanded clearinghouse adding a UEI field in mid-October. Some people may need to take action on that, some may not. You can refer to the email that went out to the listserv. And then also there's a session tomorrow on agency implementation of UEI if you have other questions about it. But we've done kind of what we could for now from a Subawards perspective to adopt this change into the templates, but we've received a lot of questions about this, so definitely paying attention to it. So I think we're going to go back to some questions, but before we do, just a quick note. Speaking of listservs, when you email the listserv, everyone's going to get the email. So there are sometimes that's a great thing when we want to foster a conversation, but for sometimes that's not a great thing. And I think there's a lot of emails hitting the listserv as like within the last hour or so. So if you want to join a working group, just respond directly to the working group lead. Or if you have questions about anything that we're talking about now, just email subawards at the FDP. That'll only go to a couple people and not necessarily like flood everyone's inbox with reply all and conversations on the listserv. So just try and be judicious when emailing the listserv. We love when people reach out with questions and get responses from the community, but sometimes it can balloon out of control. So Amanda, did we have other questions you wanted to look at?
Sure, and I just wanted to comment too on the UEI. We did notice that the UEI DUNS is on the standalone 3B, and then it's not, the UEI reference is not in the 3B that's embedded in the template. Stephanie Stone has already updated the template, and she sent it to me like a little bit ago, and I haven't uploaded it yet and published it, so I apologize. I will get that done this week. And yes, we do have some more questions. Stephanie actually just had a comment, and I think this goes to your point earlier, Kari, about what institutions are doing around the 216 compliance. Stephanie says, we're meeting with compliance and our global health department this week. Global Health has developed some robust documentation to vet compliance of foreign subs. I may be able to share some versions of those documents with the FDP community. We also received a question that said, is it appropriate to issue a deobligation of funds when the carryover of funds is denied?
So a deobligation of funds when the carry forward is denied, you can, and I think a lot of people do, but also the template does say, let's see, the amendment template does say that the subrecipient is responsible for tracking unobligated balances in subsequent carryover approvals. And so if they do have a balance, the subrecipient is not authorized to use funds from prior periods unless approval is granted by the pass-through entity. So people do this differently. They just rely on that to tell subrecipients that they can't spend from previous periods when carry forward is denied. But then a lot of institutions also deobligate so that they can reconcile the funds in their own system. A lot of pass-through entities do that as well, including my institution.
Absolutely. And I think the question, is it appropriate? Yes, it's absolutely appropriate to issue that that notification so that the subrecipient knows not to be looking for that money or following up on it at any point. If you've gotten a clear no from the government, I think it's totally fine either way. I mean, as Kevin said, you know, there's other options too, but
And there's
if you're
also,
wondering.
there's another question earlier that I answered in the Q&A box, but when it comes to de-obligations at the end of an award or terminations, there's also differing opinions on how to approach that. Like, do you need to terminate the sub and then issue a de-obligation amendment later? Or can the termination amendment serve as, you know, any funds that were not spent are hereby de-obligated? So different ways to approach that.
I think the person who asked the question about sending a de-obligation says, well, then the de-obligation seems to be a redundant. I think if you've already notified the subrecipient that they did not get the carryover of funds, that it was denied, then yes, perhaps the de-obligation itself is a bit redundant. But if that is your vehicle by which to notify the subrecipient that, you know, officially speaking, you do not have these funds, the carryover was denied, I think it's 6 of one, half dozen of another, as Kevin said. Somebody commented, please update the UEI on the LOI. Yes, we will absolutely do that. In the UEI/DUNS field, would that indicate you display both, or does that indicate an either or situation?
I don't know. I guess we're going to see an evolution of DUNS to UEI. I would just imagine before April 2022, some people would already be operating completely on UEIs and have implemented that system. So I don't know. My guess is one or the other, so as to avoid confusion. We'll know if it's actually how many digits is a UEI. If it's 9 digits, it's a DUNS, but I don't know. I don't know. Does anyone else have a better answer than that? Sorry.
I would say that maybe you could just, if you have both, if both are still active, then, you know, we put it there because some people will have a DUNS number and not a UEI, and some people will just be using their UEI. So we figured, well, during the period of transition where some people still have a DUNS and some people have already transitioned, we would have both kind of go into the field, because you really only need one or the other during this period of transition. So as long as you have one number in there, I think you're good. If somebody has given you both numbers, as long as they've demarcated or identified what they are, you know, use whatever you need to use at that moment in your systems, but eventually you'll want to transition over to using the UEI as it becomes available. So if you have the UEI, I don't think you need the DUNS number anymore. Might folks from non-member institutions who are attending FDP members be considered for the non-member template as well? So we don't have a separate non-member template. We encourage anyone, whether you're a member or not, to please use the FDP templates. You don't have to identify through the use of the templates whether you are or are not a member. However, if you are not a member, or even if you are a member and you modify those templates, then you have to remove the FDP moniker. Really, the membership piece of this comes into play around the expectation for the use of the templates and using them in a certain way between other FDP organizations. So I don't know if you guys have anything else that you wanted to add to that. It helps if you put your email signature in your put the email in our signature block, and please remind to please reply directly to that email. Sometimes there's no alternative but to reply all when the email is missing. And Alice just added in, if interested in joining the subrecipient monitoring tools working group, please contact subawards at thefdp.org. Actually, David, if you advance this to the next slide, please. I think that actually has that there. So for anyone who's looking for it, there it is. Just a suggestion to use both during the transition, DUNS through March to be sure, UEI in April for sure. The UEI is much longer and alphanumeric. They will not likely be confused. Do you think non-federal agencies will start using the UEI instead of the DUNS?
I mean, I'm pretty sure that like this primarily pertains to federal requirements. So if it's a non-federal agency, like as a sponsor, they may collect UEI as a data point for their grantees. But if I understand this correctly, I would say that I don't know what the plan for UEI is by non-federal agencies outside of this DUNS to UEI transition for federal awards only.
We got a question, is the continuing assessment tool on the docket for review by the subrecipient monitoring tools working group? That's a yes. Also, do we know how many institutions use it or a version of it? I am not sure. We don't have any numbers on that. It is not clear from, it is not about a clear no from the government. It is the PTE who, oh, I think this is going back to the question about de-obligating a subrecipient when carryover has been denied. And so the person is written to clarify it's not about a clear no from the government. It is the PTE who is doing this. This has nothing to do with a de-obligation from the feds. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I just think if you run into a situation that looks like it could be chaotic with carry forward, termination, de-obligation, anything like that, I would just start communicating with the subrecipient, or if you have questions as a subrecipient, start communicating with the pass-through entity before you start emailing drafts, because once you email the draft and someone's already did the work to set it up, maybe it's already routed in a system. Maybe people have made changes in their internal system like they have to do before they even send a draft out the door. So if you can just have a conversation to clarify, this is what we need on our end. What do you need on your end? What should this amendment look like in advance? Sometimes it pays off to have that conversation in advance but look, carry forwards, de-obligations, terminations, transfers are challenging. I can from experience, like say that these are always challenging. So I understand the concerns, but maybe start conversations early is my suggestion there.
Absolutely. And we had a follow-on comment, agreed that the de-obligation amendment is redundant, puts the onus on the PTE instead of the sub as well. Yep, I mean, I think institutions have some latitude for how they want to manage that process and what works for a given institution. Do most institutions issue a new PO each year or a single PO at the outset of subaward issuance? So again, I think this is one where we don't really have specific numbers to say this is how many of our members do X, Y, or Z. It might be great if you're available to come to the session when we announce it in October. It's going to be a listening session. You might hear a little bit more about how some institutions think about PO issuance. But I think some institutions do this differently depending on the award mechanism. If carryover is automatic, I know a lot of institutions just issue one PO for the entire 5-year period. Some institutions are required to issue a new PO every year. And sometimes they have a binary practice where it's like we always issue a new PO every year, or we always issue a PO for the entire period, and they don't do it case by case as well. So there's pretty variable practice, I think, unless you guys have different experiences. We do this based on the award mechanism. We issue one PO if it's automatic carryover, and then one PO per year if it is not. So yeah, that was good feedback from one of our member institutions. All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, did you guys have anything else?
No, just you know, again, the telecommunications ban, state law, these things, you know, like it says here on the slide, just email the three of us and happy to look into these issues. And yeah, thanks for all the questions and comments. Very, very helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate everyone's engagement as always during these sessions. And we look forward to seeing you in January.